Hi, I'm your instructor, Jason Evoy for ARH 101. And this is Lesson 2, and in Lesson 2 we are going to be taking a look at prehistoric art in Europe and the art of the ancient Near East. Now, throughout your text you will find lots of information on some really pretty incredible works of art from this early period in human history, but we're going to take a few minutes here to highlight a couple of rather interesting objects and give you some additional background. We're going to start looking way back at some of the oldest examples that we have of art from the human record, and we're going to be talking a little bit here about cave painting. So cave painting is something that's been rather enigmatic throughout the history of art, because we really don't honestly have a solid understanding of what it was that the function of these paintings really was intended to be. We don't know exactly what the intent of the artist was. We don't know how they were used. We don't know their exact purpose, and we have some pretty good ideas, but much of this is based upon evidence that we gather from the archaeological record, from carbon dating, from other things, other material culture that's been found at the given site. Because these are early enough that there's no written record, that we don't have any written language, much of what we do know about these is based upon supposition and guesswork. So the image that we're looking at here is from probably one of the best known of all of the different examples of cave paintings that we see, and this is from the Hall of the Bulls at Lascaux in France. And much of the work in this cave dates from about 15,000 to 13,000 BCE. BCE is a term that you will see frequently through this course. It refers to before Common Era. And of course, CE, that we'll see later on, refers to the Common Era. So when we talk about cave painting, we see some rather interesting conventions. A convention, by the way, is a set of guidelines or rules for creating imagery that an artist adheres to. And in this case, one of the conventions we see is the use of something called combined or twisted perspective. So when we look at this animal, we look at this bull, you'll notice that he is mostly in a profile view. But then if you look carefully, you'll notice there's something that's a little off. The horns here are actually depicted in a frontal view. And so, if you imagine what this bull would look like based upon the information we have, it's really not quite natural. You'd have one horn growing out of the forehead and one in the back of the head. But this is the most informative possible view. And we see this technique used not only by the artists who created work in these early caves, but it's something that's also quite popular in places such as ancient Egypt. And so this is another convention. This is a means in which artists convey as much information as possible in a two-dimensional surface. So artworks like this, like this bull in this cave at Lascaux, could have a couple of interesting functions, possibly. Some of the earliest beliefs about these caves include the concept of something called sympathetic magic, this being the idea that these artisans, people who would create these, would paint these images onto cave walls, were doing so in a way, in a means to exercise some sort of control over the animal. The idea being that by painting the animal on the wall, you exercise some power over its spirit. By creating an image of it, then somehow that animal is going to be more susceptible to your spear, for example. Now, we don't know if this is necessarily accurate in some cases, because one of the things that disproves this theory, at least in many caves, is the fact that it appears that oftentimes the animals who are represented here are not actually part of the food supply of the people in the area. And we can tell that by looking at some of the other material culture and bones and refuse and things within the cave system. So we know in many cases the animals that are represented were not what they ate. So that kind of possibly discounts that one. Another possible theory is that these are intended to be teaching tools. These are used to instruct new hunters, insert spear here, that sort of thing. But again, this may be a gross oversimplification. Some people hypothesize that these are actually symbolic representations of a much more complex religious system, tied with shamanism and a much more complicated series of possibilities than we can really discern simply from looking at the imagery. So we're jumping ahead quite a bit here and taking a look at another object. And this, of course, is probably one of the most famous from this chapter. And this is the circle of massive stones that we see at Stonehenge. One thing to mention, by the way, about timeline, about chronology, as we talk about this period in history. When we talk about prehistoric art, it's broken into a couple of different major periods. The first of these that we talk about is the Paleolithic. During the earlier part of the Paleolithic, the lower Paleolithic, we see mankind beginning to use stone tools and other very rudimentary technologies. By the time we get to the later part of this, which is what we call the upper Paleolithic, we see the creation of the first examples of art. Much of this is small, portable stuff, sometimes figurines and fertility totems, but also cave painting. There's a transitional period that we also see take place called the Mesolithic. The Mesolithic is where we see people make the transition from this early hunter-gatherer lifestyle, really, into that of an agrarian civilization. And then thirdly, the next period that we talk about is the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. And during the Neolithic, the key difference that we see is people settle down into agrarian lifestyles. We see the institution of things like animal husbandry, agriculture, permanent settlements, and these are all really key concepts. When we talk about art, we see that people begin to much more carefully prepare surfaces. We see the beginnings of monumental statuary or sculpture, and we also see that people become much more frequently represented in art, whereas animals were much more dominant in the earlier periods. So the construction we're looking at here at Stonehenge is from the Neolithic period. And by the way, the Neolithic period differs geographically. When we talk about Neolithic, we're really talking about technology. We're talking about what people have learned to do. And so the Neolithic period comes much earlier, for example, in the Near East than it does in Europe. And this particular construction dates over a fairly extended period of time, you'll notice. It dates from about 2550 to about 1600 BCE. And that's because Stonehenge was actually built over a fairly extended period of time and built in different stages, really. The oldest part of Stonehenge, we don't even really see all that clearly in this image, but there's an outer concentric ring that circles all the way around these massive stones. It's actually the most important part of Stonehenge, and yet it's the component that the fewest people really are aware of. But this outer perimeter, this outer ditch, is what really may have served the main function of Stonehenge. And that isn't true. It in fact does have a function. Stonehenge is more than likely intended as a form of astronomical observatory. Stonehenge is a series of, as you can see, really quite massive stones. Some of these objects, by the way, are as many as 24 feet in height. The circle's 97 feet in diameter. And it's composed of massive sarsen sandstones on the outer ring and somewhat smaller volcanic bluestones farther in, which are also, again, part of the system of organization of this rather massive construction. But this outer ring would have been, it had a series of holes, post holes. And by relocating, by moving a post from hole to hole, you were capable of tracking chronologies. You move it every day or every number of days. And we don't know exactly how they used it, but we do know that it's possible using this and also using the heel stone, which is a component of the structure that it basically casts a specific shadow on the summer and winter solstice, that it's quite possible to track some fairly sophisticated things about the calendar. One of the simplest, of course, is just tracking the summer and winter solstice. But some people have even theorized that it's possible to calculate out things as sophisticated as eclipses using the post holes on the external ring in conjunction with the heel stone. So we don't know to the extent to which these early Neolithic people in Europe used this structure. We do know that it is certainly an important site, though, and it also is tied with some fairly interesting and kind of heavy concepts too, because it doesn't stand alone. It's part of a complex, really, part of a series of other sites. There's something nearby called Woodhenge. There's another structure called the Cursus. And we do believe that human sacrifice was conducted at these locations. And more than likely, an important series of processions took place on the summer and winter solstice as part of the observation of a series of rituals. So moving on here to a different part of the world and moving on to really a very different culture. We're looking here at something from the ancient Near East. So when we talk about the ancient Near East, this is an area that today is really pretty volatile. And interestingly enough, it was quite volatile back then too. But the ancient Near East is a region that today, if we were to look at on a map, we would see places like Iraq, Iran, Syria. And so this is a part of the world that that still today faces quite a bit of conflict. But during this ancient period in history, when we're talking about, in this case, the third millennia BCE, we see the rise of a couple really important cultures. The first major one of these is the ancient Sumerians, and these are the guys that for the first time invent writing. The Sumerians invent a form of writing that today we call cuneiform, and they were also responsible for writing down the first literary work in history, which is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. An interesting read, by the way. But the Sumerians were not particularly politically organized. They were a series of independent city-states, and they eventually fall under the sway of a city called Akkad and a group of people known as the Akkadians. So we have a guy by the name of Sargon, and Sargon basically unifies Sumeria. And for the first time, we see all of these city-states owing allegiance to a king, to a single king. And this is a new concept. So Sargon was a very powerful and important man in that respect. His grandson was a guy by the name of Naram-Sin. And Naram-Sin follows in his grandfather's footsteps in terms of his leadership role. And the object that we see here is something called the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin. It's located in the Louvre today. It's a massive piece of sandstone. It's about 6'7" in height. And this shows some really interesting conventions. And you may remember I mentioned that word a little bit ago, a convention being a series of concepts or ideas or a framework really for reference that an artist uses. And there are some important ones here. First off, it's pretty easy to pick out Naram-Sin. If you look carefully, he's up towards the upper half of the object, of the relief carving here. And he is huge. He is massive, much bigger than anybody else in the composition. And even the mountain doesn't look that large compared to Naram-Sin. So this is one of these conventions. This is something we call hierarchical scale. This is the use of rendering someone as being larger depending upon their importance. Another convention which is kind of important in the Near East, if you look carefully at Naram-Sin, you'll see he's got horns. And these, by the way, are represented in a twisted perspective, the same technique we saw in Lascaux with the bulls. But Naram-Sin is shown here being enormous, wearing horns, and even carrying some things that signify his importance. A rod showing his leadership. And by the way, the horns in this case are actually a symbol of divinity. And so in the Near East, having horns like this is a way to establish that you're not a mere mortal, but really you are akin to a god. Up above, we have stars shining down on him, which show the god's favor, looking down. And then we also can see some other things going on here that are interesting. Naram-Sin is literally walking on his enemies, crushing them underfoot. We have them cowing and begging for mercy in front of him, tumbling and falling down the mountain. Also interesting to note that the enemies here, which, by the way, is a group of people called the Lalubi, who he defeated, they're shown in this very kind of loose, random posture. You can see their limbs are all kind of twisted, and his soldiers, on the other hand, are all quite rigid and upright, showing their organization, their strength, and their power. So just looking at this object, we can really glean a tremendous amount of information about Naram-Sin and about the ancient Akkadians. So this is a much more recent picture of an object from this region of the world. You can tell because we have some U.S. military personnel included. But this is another really important site. Akkadian power doesn't last forever. Eventually, the Sumerians basically reinstate their own dynasties. It's called the Neo-Sumerian period, which comes after the Akkadians. The Akkadians actually fall prey to some foreign invaders, and then the Neo-Sumerians fill in the power vacuum. And they establish a new power center, really, at a place called Ur. And this is one of these ancient cities, which is also mentioned in the Bible, by the way. And it was one of those places that was kind of considered to be semi-mythological, really, until it was actually discovered. But this is a site that is really quite interesting for us, because this is a type of object that was really quite popular in the ancient Near East. We have these massive constructions. They're made of mud brick, not of stone, because mud brick is what we had. They didn't have much in the way of stone in the ancient Near East like you see in Egypt and some other places. And so mud brick was the building material of choice. Downside to this today, of course, is that many of these structures don't survive. And in fact, what you're looking at here is not its lasting condition. It's been restored. It was actually refaced, at any rate, partially restored. The staircase and the facing were remade under the reign of Saddam Hussein. But this object you're looking at here is something called a ziggurat. And a ziggurat is a monumental platform, this huge platform, which was a support for a temple. It's not a building per se, because it's not hollow, it's solid. But this is an enormous raised platform on which you would find another structure. And on top of this, we would find a temple, in this case to a Sumerian goddess. And so structures like this were found at sites like Uruk as well as Ur, and also the famed Tower of Babylon, in fact, would have been a ziggurat, much like this, but probably quite a bit taller. So another group of people that we talk about when we look at the ancient Near East are the Babylonians, and these guys are quite famous, of course. And during the Babylonian period, there's one person in particular who we really have to look at and talk about, because he does something that is absolutely tremendous, historically speaking. And this is Hammurabi. So Hammurabi was he was actually Amorite. He wasn't even Babylonian, but this was a group of people who came into the region and pretty quickly established power. But he rose to power in Babylon and did some interesting things, had some interesting techniques in order to solidify his power base. See, it's quite likely that there was already an existing set of rules, of laws. But what he does that's really unique is for the first time he codifies these laws and has them written literally in stone. And so what you're looking at here is the stele with the law code of Hammurabi from Susa in Iran. And by the way, that's not its original location. It was looted, taken to Iran, and then discovered later. And then now, of course, it's located in the Louvre. So these objects have moved around quite a bit, historically speaking. But Hammurabi creates this series of laws, or really codifies them, writes them down, and has them erected. And what he does as well that's quite amazing is he shows himself on the stele receiving the laws, not just really receiving the laws themselves, but receiving the justification to rule by the sun god, Shamash. We look at this detail here. You can see Hammurabi on the left, and you can see Shamash on the right. And so this is a validation of his power and authority. He's able to show in this image, well, see, here's the God giving me the power. He's handing me the rod to rule. And so these laws come from the gods and from me, and I am the authorized representative of Shamash here on earth. And so Shamash is shown as absolutely enormous. You can see he's sitting down, but even seated, he is just about the same height, or maybe a touch taller than Hammurabi is. We can also see he's got a series of horns on his head, and they're actually shown in profile view, which is quite revolutionary in this case. And again, if you'll remember, these horns are symbols of divinity. Some other important conventions that we see here, in addition to the use of hierarchical scale, this is one of the earliest cases of foreshortening. We can see in both the beard of Shamash and how it's rendered, and also the way that Hammurabi's arms cross over each other, that the artist here is actually making a fairly significant attempt at representing realistic space. So rather than having these very flattened images, like we see in a lot of earlier examples, we have an attempt here to really illustrate a sense of depth and to really show a much more progressive view of the human figure. So another important group we'll talk about would be the ancient Assyrians from the Near East. And the Assyrians were a very militaristic people. These guys managed to establish an empire that ranged all the way down to the Nile. These guys were very, very, very powerful. And when we look at their architecture, we can really get a sense of their military orientation. They would build these massive constructions called citadels, these big fortified city palaces. And you'll see examples of that in your text. But one of the components of these, it's really fascinating, are these enormous statues called lamassu. And so lamassu are composite creatures. They include some human features, in this case a head, you can see here, this is human, and then they include a body of typically either a bull or a lion, and then wings. And so this is a creature that's intended to represent the intelligence of a person, but the power and abilities of these beasts. And so these were really, really intense and powerful looking creatures. They're also massive in scale. Many of these average anywhere from 10 to 14 feet tall, and weigh as much as 40 tons in some cases. So they are really tremendously monstrous creatures. And their function is really fascinating. These would be found in pairs more often than not, and they'd be found in gateways. So when you were entering into an important location, into the main component of the citadel, or into a palace chamber, for example, you might have to walk past these guys. And they were intended to express and to convey this sense of power and authority. They were guardian figures. One of the unusual features you'll notice about this Lamassu, and about many of the earlier ones, is that it has 5 legs. Later in the Assyrian period, they go back to just having 4, but this is done for a couple specific reasons. One is because when you're looking at this creature from the front, when you're approaching and you see this pair of Lamassu flanking a gateway, they appear to be stoic and standing upright with their feet directly in front of them. But then when you walk between them, we have the illusion of movement, of them striding powerfully forward. And so this is again done in a way to convey this sense of power and authority. So that's a few important objects, a couple of interesting things highlighted for you. And again, you're going to find a lot more information about these in your text. But I wanted to take a moment to give you a little bit of additional background and point out a few of my favorites when we're looking at this period in history, and talk with you about a couple of the things that I think you might find particularly interesting. So enjoy your reading, and if you have any questions, of course, please feel free to email me and get in touch with me, and I'll get back with you.